Bikers mess with the wrong soldiers at a gas station. What happens next will shock you. Welcome to an incredible story of resilience and justice. In a small North Carolina town, a group of bikers decided to challenge the wrong man at a gas station. What they didn't know was that this quiet soldier was fresh from active duty, with training and composure that would leave everyone stunned. Let's dive into this tale of discipline, courage, and unexpected consequences. The sun was setting over the North Carolina highway as Staff Sergeant James Miller guided his dusty blue Ford pickup into Wilson's gas station. The small station sat alone on the outskirts of Fort Bragg, its neon sign flickering weakly in the growing darkness. After 15 months in Afghanistan, even this simple sight of a regular American gas station felt strange to James. He pulled up to pump number 3, the gravel crunching under his tires. His military fatigues were still crisp and clean. He hadn't even taken the time to change after landing. All he could think about was getting home to surprise his wife Sarah and their 6-year-old daughter Emma. They weren't expecting him for another week, but he'd managed to catch an early transport home. The evening air was warm and humid, typical for North Carolina in late summer. James stepped out of his truck, his combat boots hitting the ground with a familiar thud. He stretched his tall, lean frame, working out the stiffness from the long drive from the airport. At 32, James looked younger than his age, except for his eyes. Those eyes had seen too much during his 3 tours of duty. Inside his wallet, James smiled at the crayon drawing Emma had sent him 2 months ago. He'd kept it perfectly folded, protected from the harsh Afghan environment. It showed their family, 3 stick figures with big smiles, standing in front of their house. "Come home soon, Daddy," she'd written in wobbly letters. Well, baby girl, he thought. Daddy's finally coming home. The gas station was quiet, with only one other car parked near the convenience store entrance. Through the store's windows, James could see an elderly clerk reading a newspaper behind the counter. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that it almost felt unreal after spending so many months in a combat zone. As James inserted his credit card into the pump, his military training kept him aware of his surroundings, a habit he couldn't shake off even here at home. He noticed the security camera above the store entrance, the blind spots behind the ice machine, and the clear sight lines to the highway. These automatic assessments had saved his life overseas, but here they were just echoes of another world. He started filling his tank, watching the numbers climb on the digital display. His mind wandered to the surprise he had planned. Sarah would probably cry. She always did during their reunions. Emma would definitely jump into his arms. She was at that perfect age where Dad was still her hero. He'd missed her last birthday, but the teddy bear in his duffel bag wearing a miniature army uniform would hopefully make up for it. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine trees and nearby barbecue, so different from the dusty air he'd breathed for the past 15 months. A few crickets had started their nightly chorus in the tall grass behind the station. Everything felt so wonderfully ordinary, yet somehow special at the same time. James checked his watch. 7:45 p.m. If he drove straight through, he could be home by 9:30. Sarah usually put Emma to bed around 8:30, but he knew his little girl often convinced her mom to read just one more story. They'd probably still be up when he got there. The gas pump clicked off, and James replaced the nozzle. He'd need to grab some water for the rest of the drive, maybe some coffee too. The excitement of coming home early had kept him going so far, but he could feel fatigue creeping in after the long flight and drive. As he screwed the gas cap back on, James heard the distant rumble of motorcycles. The sound grew louder, echoing off the trees surrounding the station. Something about the aggressive rev of the engines made his combat-trained senses tingle with awareness. He'd learned long ago to trust these instincts. 3 motorcycles appeared on the highway, their headlights cutting through the growing dusk. They turned into the station, engines thundering in the quiet evening air. The bikes were large cruisers, decorated with chrome and custom paint jobs. Their riders were big men, dressed in leather vests covered with patches. James stood straight, his face neutral but alert. As the bikers circled around to the other side of the pump station, you could feel their eyes on him, sizing up his military uniform. He'd dealt with enough hostile situations to know that the peaceful evening was about to change. Little did these bikers know, they were about to mess with the wrong soldier. The three motorcycles circled the gas station like sharks, their engines growling in the evening air. They'd finally parked their bikes in a row, taking up more space than necessary near the store entrance. James watched them through his peripheral vision, maintaining his calm exterior while his mind assessed each rider. The leader was easy to spot, a massive man standing well over 6 feet tall with a scraggly gray beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. His leather vest displayed a patch that read Road Devils NC, along with several other badges that marked him as the group's president. The other two riders were smaller, but still intimidating, one with a shaved head and the other wearing a bandana. As they dismounted their bikes, their boots crunched on the gravel, and their leather gear creaked. They were talking loudly and laughing, shooting obvious glances in James's direction. The soldier continued about his business, wiping his hands with a paper towel after finishing with the gas pump. He'd seen their type before, bullies looking for trouble. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The leader called out, his voice deliberately loud. "Looks like one of Uncle Sam's toy soldiers decided to grace us with his presence." His companion snickered on cue, like background actors in a bad movie. James turned slightly, acknowledging them with a brief nod, but nothing more. He'd learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the best defense was to deny potential enemies the engagement they sought. But the bikers weren't done yet. The leader, who his friends called Bear, started walking toward James. His path was intentionally indirect. Predator's approach. "Hey boys," Bear announced. "Maybe we should thank him for his service." The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. As Bear got closer, James could smell the mixture of cigarettes and cheap beer on his breath. The biker was trying to use his size to intimidate, standing unnecessarily close. James remained still, his combat-trained muscles ready but relaxed, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. "You know what I think about the military," Bear growled, now standing directly in James's personal space. "I think you guys just play dress up and waste our tax dollars." He deliberately bumped his shoulder into James as he passed, heading toward the store entrance. The other two bikers followed their leader's example, each making sure to bump into James as they passed. The one with the bandana spat on the ground near James's boots, while the bald one muttered something about government puppets. Through it all, James remained statue still. His face betrayed no emotion, but his mind was cataloging every detail. The way Bear favored his right leg slightly, suggesting an old injury. How the bald one kept his left hand near his belt, possibly concealing a weapon. The nervous energy of the one with the bandana, making him the most unpredictable. Inside the store, the elderly clerk watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He'd seen trouble start this way before, and his hand moved closer to the phone behind the counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Bear and his friends entered the store, the bell above the door chiming innocently. James knew he needed water and coffee for his drive home, which meant he'd have to go into the store too. He took a slow, deep breath, the same way he used to before leading his unit on patrol. The peaceful evening he'd been enjoying had evaporated, replaced by a familiar tension he knew all too well. As he walked toward the store entrance, James thought about his wife and daughter waiting at home. He didn't want trouble. He'd seen enough violence to last a lifetime. But 15 months in a war zone had taught him that sometimes trouble finds you, whether you want it or not. The bell chimed again as James pushed open the door, stepping into what was quickly becoming a powder keg of a situation. The convenience store's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as James stepped inside. The cool air from the AC hit his face, a sharp contrast to the humid evening outside. Behind the counter, the elderly clerk, his name tag reading Frank, watched the scene with worried eyes. He'd been running this store for 30 years and could smell trouble brewing from a mile away. Bear and his two friends were spreading out through the small store, knocking items off shelves accidentally as they moved. The bald one, who the others called Spike, was standing near the coffee machine, deliberately blocking access to it. The guy with the bandana, nicknamed Snake, was opening and closing the cooler doors with unnecessary force. James moved calmly to the water section, keeping his awareness sharp. 15 months in Afghanistan had taught him to track multiple threats while appearing casual. He could sense Bear watching him through the chip aisle's mirror, waiting for any sign of fear or aggression. "Hey, soldier boy," Bear called out, his voice echoing in the small store. "You think you're some kind of hero?" He picked up a bag of chips, crushed it in his massive hand, and dropped it back on the shelf. "My cousin joined the army, came back in a box. What do you think about that?" James selected his water bottle, keeping his movements smooth and controlled. He knew Bear was trying to provoke him, looking for any excuse to start something. The soldier had seen this tactic before: create a scene, provoke a response, then claim self-defense. "Can't even answer a simple question," Snake chimed in, slamming another cooler door. "Maybe they don't teach manners in the army anymore." He laughed, a high-pitched sound that didn't match his tough guy appearance. Frank, the clerk, had served in Vietnam. He recognized the look in James's eyes, the calm focus of someone who'd seen real combat, not just bar fights. His hand rested on the phone, ready to call the police if things got worse. James moved toward the coffee station, but Spike didn't budge. "Excuse me," James said quietly, his first words since entering the store. His voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone used to giving orders. "What's that?" Spike mocked, cupping his ear. Did the toy soldier say something? He pretended to pour himself coffee, spilling it deliberately on the floor. "Oops, looks like there's been a spill. Better call in the military to clean it up." Bear walked over, his heavy boots leaving dirty marks on the freshly mopped floor. He stood next to Spike, creating a wall of leather and attitude between James and the coffee machine. "You know what I think?" he growled, getting close enough that James could count the gray hairs in his beard. "I think you military types think you're better than everyone else, walking around in your fancy uniforms, expecting people to bow down and thank you." James remained silent, his eyes forward, but his muscles were coiled and ready. He'd spent years training for close-quarter combat, learning how to handle multiple opponents in tight spaces, but he also knew that the best fight was the one you could avoid. Snake appeared behind James, completing their triangle of intimidation. "Maybe we should teach him some respect," he suggested, cracking his knuckles for effect. The sound echoed off the store's walls like small firecrackers. Frank watched as the tension built. He'd seen enough bar fights and street brawls to know this was reaching a breaking point. The old veteran's fingers hovered over the phone keypad, ready to dial for help. That's when Bear made his fatal mistake. Reaching out with his massive hand, he grabbed the American flag patch on James's uniform shoulder. "What's this worth to you, soldier boy?" he sneered, starting to pull at it. "Let's see how tough you really are." The air in the store seemed to freeze. James's eyes shifted slowly from the coffee machine to Bear's face. Something changed in those eyes, a switch being flipped from passive observer to trained warrior. The three bikers had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Time seemed to slow down in the fluorescent-lit store as Bear's fingers gripped James's flag patch. Frank, the elderly clerk, saw something change in the soldier's posture, a subtle shift that his old Vietnam veteran's instincts recognized immediately. It was like watching a lion wake up after pretending to be asleep. "You know what else I hate about you military types?" Bear continued, oblivious to the danger he was in. He gave the patch another tug, threads starting to snap. "You come back here thinking you're some kind of heroes, but what's so heroic about dropping bombs from the sky, huh?" James stood perfectly still, his mind flashing back to the brothers he'd lost overseas. He thought about Private Jenkins, who'd stepped on an IED while protecting a school, about Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd taken a bullet while carrying a wounded civilian child to safety, about Captain Thompson, who sacrificed himself to save his entire unit. Snake moved closer, encouraged by James's continued silence. "Maybe he's scared," he taunted, reaching out to poke James in the back. "Not so tough without your whole army behind you, are you?" Spike laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the store's windows. "Hey, Bear, maybe we should take his uniform as a souvenir. Bet it'd make a nice Halloween costume." He reached for James's sleeve, his fingers dirty and greasy. That's when Bear made his final mistake. He spat on the floor, right next to James's polished boots, and said the words that sealed his fate. "Your dead military buddies? Probably better off that way. At least they don't have to pretend to be heroes anymore." The fluorescent light seemed to flicker as James finally moved his head, slowly turning to look Bear directly in the eyes. Frank watched the soldier's face change, not with anger or fear, but with a cold, professional focus that made the old veteran's spine tingle. "I've seen guys like you before," James spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the store. "In every country I've served in, there are always bullies who mistake kindness for weakness." His words were calm, measured, like he was giving a report. Bear blinked, suddenly uncertain. Something in James's tone made him loosen his grip on the flag patch. For the first time, the biker leader noticed the combat ribbons on James's chest, the Special Forces badge, the Ranger tab. His eyes widened as he realized he might have misjudged the situation. "You better watch your mouth, soldier boy," Snake threatened, but his voice cracked slightly. He could feel the change in the air, like the pressure drop before a storm. James slowly reached up and removed Bear's hand from his uniform. His grip was firm, controlled, and much stronger than the biker expected. "I'm going to give you one chance," James said quietly. "Walk away now. Get on your bikes and leave." Spike, trying to salvage their tough guy image, stepped forward aggressively. "Or what? There's 3 of us and 1 of you. What do you think you're going to do?" James didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked each biker in the eye, one by one, with the same expression he'd worn while clearing buildings in Kandahar. It was the look of someone who had faced real danger and wasn't impressed by playground bullies. "Last chance," James said simply. "Walk away." There, his pride stung, made the decision that would haunt him for months to come. He pulled back his massive fist, muscles tensing under his leather vest. "Get him!" he growled to his friends. Frank reached for the phone, but he knew it would be too late for the police to prevent what was about to happen. The old veteran said a quiet prayer, not for the soldier, but for the 3 bikers who had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Bear's fist cut through the air where James's head had been just a split second before. The soldier had moved with a speed that surprised everyone in the store, stepping inside Bear's reach and disrupting his balance. Before the biker could recover, James had already shifted to a combat stance, feet planted, hands ready, eyes alert. "What they?" Bear started to say, but his words were cut short as James executed a perfect armlock maneuver. The same move he used countless times during close-quarters combat training now sent the massive biker stumbling forward, his own momentum working against him. Snake and Spike rushed in from different directions, thinking their numbers would overwhelm the soldier. They had never faced someone with Special Forces training, someone who had spent years learning how to handle multiple opponents in tight spaces. Their street fighting experience was about to meet military precision. James moved like water between the attackers. He sidestepped Snake's wild punch, redirecting the biker's momentum to send him crashing into a chip display. In the same fluid motion, he blocked Spike's attempt to grab him, using the bald biker's forward motion to throw them off balance. Frank watched in amazement from behind the counter. In his Vietnam days, he'd seen trained soldiers in action, but this was different. James wasn't fighting with anger or violence. He was controlling the situation with calculated efficiency, like a chess master thinking 3 moves ahead. Bear recovered and charged again, roaring like his namesake. James met the charge with a textbook combat technique. He stepped slightly to the side, used Bear's momentum against him, and applied precise pressure to the biker's elbow and shoulder. The massive man found himself face down on the floor before he even realized what had happened. Snake scrambled up from the fallen chip rack, potato chips crunching under his boots. He pulled out a small knife from his belt, its blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. "You're dead now, soldier boy," he snarled, slashing wildly. James's response was immediate and decisive. Years of combat training took over as he deflected the knife hand, trapped it, and applied pressure to Snake's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor as Snake howled in pain, his arm locked in a hole that could break it with just a little more pressure. Spike tried to attack from behind, but James had been tracking his movement through the reflection in the store window. The soldier dropped his center of gravity, used Snake's trapped arm as leverage, and sent both bikers tumbling over each other like bowling pins. Bear was getting up again, his face red with rage and embarrassment. James released Snake and turned to face the biker leader. "Stay down," he advised calmly. "You don't want this to continue." But Bear was beyond listening. He charged forward, throwing a haymaker punch that would have knocked out a normal man. James slipped the punch like a professional boxer, stepped inside Bear's guard, and executed a perfect hip throw. The big biker went airborne for a brief moment before crashing hard onto his back, the impact forcing all the air from his lungs. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 big, tough bikers lay on the floor, groaning and dazed, while James stood calmly in the center of the store. Not a single item on the shelves had been broken except for the chip rack Snake had fallen into. Frank noticed that James hadn't thrown a single punch. Every move had been defensive, designed to neutralize rather than harm. This wasn't street violence. This was military efficiency at its finest. "The police are on their way," Frank announced, his hand still on the phone. He could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder. James straightened his uniform and looked at the 3 fallen bikers. "Next time," he said quietly, "think twice before you disrespect the flag or the soldiers who die defending it." Red and blue lights flashed through the store windows as 2 police cars pulled into the gas station. The evening air filled with the crunch of tires on gravel and the brief whoop of a siren. Frank had already pulled up the security camera footage on the store's ancient computer system, while James stood calmly near the coffee machine, finally pouring himself that much-needed cup. Officer Sarah Martinez, a veteran cop with 15 years on the force, was the first through the door. She took in the scene with experienced eyes. 3 large bikers sprawled on the floor, a scattered chip display, and a soldier calmly adding cream to his coffee. "Evening, ma'am," James said politely, his military bearing evident in his posture. "I apologize for the disturbance." Bear was slowly sitting up. His pride hurt more than his body. Snake and Spike were still trying to untangle themselves from each other, their leather jackets creaking with every movement. The knife Snake had pulled lay harmlessly on the floor, now marked as evidence. Frank called it in. Officer Martinez said, addressing James, said something about 3 bikers causing trouble with a soldier. Her partner, Officer Thompson, was already checking on the fallen bikers, making sure none of them needed immediate medical attention. "That's correct," James replied. "These gentlemen took issue with my uniform. When words failed to resolve the situation, I was forced to defend myself." He spoke like he was giving a mission report, clear and concise. Frank shuffled over to Officer Martinez, the security footage playing on his phone. "Got it all right here," he said proudly. "These boys started it. The soldier. He gave them every chance to walk away." The officers watched the footage, their eyebrows rising as they saw how efficiently James had handled the situation. "Special Forces?" Officer Martinez asked, noticing the patches on James's uniform. "Yes, ma'am. Staff Sergeant James Miller just returned from Afghanistan." Bear stumbled to his feet, his massive frame swaying slightly. "We want to press charges," he demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "He attacked us." Officer Thompson looked up from his notepad. "Sir, the footage clearly shows you threw the first punch." "And," he added, picking up Snake's knife, "bringing a weapon into the situation makes this a whole different ballgame." Snake's face went pale. He had a record, and bringing a knife to a fight would definitely violate his parole. Spike just sat on the floor, staring at his boots, all his earlier bravado gone. "Here's what's going to happen," Officer Martinez announced, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "We're taking statements from everyone. But based on the footage and witness testimony, this was clearly self-defense." She turned to the bikers. "You 3, however, are coming down to the station." As the officers began reading rights and taking statements, Frank approached James with a fresh cup of coffee. "This one's on the house, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Reminds me of something that happened in '69, outside Saigon." James listened respectfully as Frank shared a brief war story, recognizing the bond that connected soldiers across generations. The old veteran's eyes grew misty as he talked about his own homecoming, so different from today's world. Outside, more patrol cars had arrived. The officers were running the bikers' IDs, discovering outstanding warrants for Bear and a parole violation for Snake. Their tough guy act had crumbled in the face of real consequences. Officer Martinez approached James one last time. "You handled that situation perfectly, Sergeant," she said admiringly. "Minimal force, no serious injuries, clear self-defense. You're free to go. Welcome home, by the way." James thanked her, gathered his coffee and water, and prepared to leave. As he walked past the bikers, now in handcuffs, Bear couldn't meet his eyes. The massive biker had learned a hard lesson about judging people by their appearance rather than their capabilities. Frank watched from his counter as James headed for the door. "Hey, Sergeant," he called out. "Next time you're passing through, the coffee's always free for you." The police station buzzed with activity as Bear, Snake, and Spike sat in separate interview rooms, their tough guy facades completely shattered. Detective Roberts, a 20-year veteran of the force, reviewed their records on his computer screen while shaking his head in disbelief. "So you're telling me," he said to Bear, whose real name turned out to be Stanley Thompson, "that you thought it was a good idea to pick a fight with a Special Forces soldier?" The detective's voice carried a mix of amusement and disappointment. Bear slumped in his chair, his massive shoulders drooping. His leather vest had been confiscated as evidence, revealing a faded Led Zeppelin t-shirt underneath that made him look surprisingly ordinary. "We didn't know he was Special Forces," he mumbled. In the next room, Snake was facing his parole officer, Mrs. Jenkins, a stern-faced woman who'd seen it all. "A knife," she said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "You brought a knife to a fistfight at a gas station. Do you understand what this means for your parole?" Meanwhile, at Wilson's gas station, the evening had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Frank was busy putting the chip display back together, but he kept pausing to rewatch the security footage on his phone. Each time he showed it to a customer, his voice swelled with pride as if he'd been part of the action himself. "See that move right there?" he'd say, pointing at the screen. "That's what they taught us in Vietnam. Well, not that smooth, but similar." The customers would gather around, watching in amazement as James efficiently neutralized 3 attackers without throwing a single punch. Local Muse vans had started arriving at the station. The story of a Special Forces soldier defending himself against 3 bikers was too good to pass up. Reporter Lisa Chen from Channel 7 interviewed Frank, who gave a colorful play-by-play of the events. "It was like watching a dance," Frank told the camera, gesturing enthusiastically. "These 3 big guys thought they had him cornered, but that soldier, he moved like water. Reminded me of my buddy Martinez back in '69. Back at the police station, Officer Martinez was finishing up her report. The charges were piling up: attempted assault, carrying a concealed weapon, parole violation, and several outstanding warrants that the incident had brought to light. She couldn't help but smile at how a simple act of bullying had led to their downfall. In the station's break room, officers gathered around a laptop, watching the gas station security footage that had already started circulating among law enforcement groups. "That's how you handle multiple attackers," the department's self-defense instructor commented admiringly. "Perfect textbook techniques." Snake's knife had been logged into evidence, along with statements from all parties involved. The weapon would add another 6 months to his sentence, minimum. Spike, whose real name was Timothy Parker, called his wife to bail them out. Her angry voice could be heard through the phone across the room. Social media was already buzzing with the story. Someone had captured part of the incident on their phone from the gas station parking lot, and the video was going viral. Comments poured in from veterans and civilians alike, praising the soldiers' restraint and skill. Frank's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Old military buddies called after recognizing his gas station on the news, and they swapped stories about their own experiences. The elderly veteran felt younger with each retelling, proudly describing how he'd known trouble was coming the moment those bikers rolled in. As the night shift took over at the police station, Detective Roberts gathered the final statements. The 3 bikers would face a judge in the morning, their reputations in the local biker community forever tarnished. Their Road Devils NC patches didn't seem so intimidating now, stuffed in evidence bags. Officer Martinez pinned the last photos to her caseboard, 3 mugshots showing faces that were more embarrassed than injured. Next to them, she placed the gas station security camera shots, a perfect sequence showing how training and discipline had triumphed over brute force and intimidation. As James Miller finally pulled into his driveway at 10:15 p.m., the porch light was still on, and through the window, you could see his wife Sarah reading a book on the couch. The events at the gas station had delayed his surprise homecoming by almost an hour, but now, looking at his home, none of that seemed to matter. Meanwhile, across town, the story of what happened at Wilson's gas station was spreading like wildfire through the local veteran community. At the FW Post 2876, veterans gathered around phones and tablets, watching the viral video of the incident. Old-timers nodded in approval, recognizing the disciplined response that could only come from years of professional military training. "That's the difference between real training and bar fights," said retired Master Surgeon Wilson, pointing at the screen. "No shouting, no macho nonsense, just pure efficiency." The other veterans murmured in agreement, many of them having faced similar situations during their own transitions back to civilian life. The county jail, Bear, Snake, and Spike sat in separate holding cells, each lost in their own thoughts. Bear stared at his hands that had intimidated so many people before, but had proved useless against real combat training. The tough guy image he'd built over years had been dismantled in seconds by a soldier who hadn't even thrown a punch. Frank closed up the gas station for the night, but not before putting up a new sign behind the counter: "Veterans always welcome. Free coffee." He carefully stored the security footage on his personal USB drive, knowing it would become a regular feature at his weekly veterans breakfast meetings. The local newspaper was already preparing their morning headline: "Special Forces Soldier Shows Restraint in Gas Station Confrontation." The article would focus not on the fight itself, but on how military training emphasized control and de-escalation over violence. Back at James' house, as he walked up the pathway, the front door suddenly flew open. 6-year-old Emma, who was supposed to be in bed, came running out in her pajamas. "Daddy, she screamed, launching herself into his arms. Sarah appeared in the doorway, tears already streaming down her face. As James hugged his daughter and kissed his wife, the events at the gas station felt like a distant memory. Emma touched the flag patch on his uniform, the same patch Bear had tried to disrespect, and said proudly, "My daddy's a soldier." The next morning, at Fort Bragg, James's commanding officer received multiple emails praising his soldiers' conduct. The security footage had made its way through military channels, and instructors were already planning to use it as a training example of proper threat management and minimum force response. The Road Devils NC Club held an emergency meeting to discuss the incident. By unanimous vote, they expelled Bear, Snake, and Spike from their ranks. The club president made it clear: disrespecting veterans would never be tolerated, and the 3 had brought shame to their organization. A week later, Frank hosted his regular veterans breakfast at the gas station. The small store was packed with former service members from various eras: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. They shared stories, drank free coffee, and discussed how military training had shaped their lives even after service. Officer Martinez stopped by during her morning patrol. She'd added the gas station security footage to the police academy's training materials, using it to demonstrate how proper training and self-control could defuse dangerous situations without excessive force. As for the 3 bikers, their court date approached with a heavy weight of consequences. Their actions had not only earned them legal troubles, but had also taught them a valuable lesson about judging others. Bear, facing the longest sentence due to his prior warrants, wrote a letter of apology to be delivered to the base, expressing remorse for disrespecting the uniform and those who wore it. The story became a local legend, shared at barbershops, diners, and veterans meetings. It wasn't a tale of violence or revenge, but rather one of discipline, training, and the quiet strength that true warriors carry. It served as a reminder that real heroes don't seek fights, but they certainly know how to end them. This powerful story reminds us of the quiet strength carried by those who have served. Sergeant James Miller's composure and restraint teach us a valuable lesson about dignity and discipline in the face of adversity. If this story inspired you as much as it did us, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of bravery and humanity. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.